The silver bell rang 3 times through marble corridors, and the eunuch Rashid knew his life had exactly 7 heartbeats left. Dawn prayers echoed from the minaret as footsteps approached his chamber. Heavy boots on marble. Guards. At least 4. His master, the Grand Vizier, had died in the night. Poison, they whispered, and Rashid controlled too many secrets to be allowed another sunrise. 7,000 eunuchs had served in this palace over centuries. Most died like this, not from age or illness, but because they knew which ministers took bribes, which wives met lovers, which princes plotted against their fathers. The door handle turned. Rashid pressed his forehead to his prayer mat one final time. 23 years since they'd cut away his manhood. 23 years of perfect service. 23 years that meant nothing now. In the Sultan's palace, eunuchs were tools, valuable while useful, disposable when inconvenient. His pale fingers, soft from decades inside these walls, trembled against the silk carpet. The locks clicked open, one by one. 3 locks, 3 chances gone. Outside, 7,000 other ghosts waited, all the castrated boys who'd walked these halls before him, who'd died because their protectors died first. How did an empire create a system where castrated boys became so essential that their masters' deaths meant their own executions? Why did thousands of mutilated men control the most intimate secrets of Islamic power? To understand why Rashid faces death this dawn, we must rewind through 1,000 years of systematic mutilation that began with simple mathematics. 9 boys died to create every eunuch who lived. The slave trader's fingers pressed against the boy's groin, calculating profit margins in flesh. Numbers mattered more than names in the eunuch trade. 10 boys purchased meant maybe 3 survivors if the surgeon was skilled, maybe 1 if he wasn't. The mathematics were brutal but simple. Traders in Baghdad's market spoke of acceptable wastage the way merchants discussed spoiled grain. 9 dead boys for every living eunuch. Standard business practice across 1,000 years of Islamic rule. The process started with selection. Boys between 8 and 12 brought the best prices. Too young, and they died from shock. Too old, and their bodies had already begun the changes that castration was meant to prevent. Slave traders developed an eye for the right candidates. Healthy enough to survive the knife, young enough to forget their birth names, intelligent enough to serve but not so clever they'd cause trouble. Here's where it gets worse. The traders kept ledgers, detailed records of purchases, procedures, and profits. A surviving document from 1298 shows one Damascus trader's monthly accounts. Bought 43 boys from Circassian dealers, 38 suitable for cutting, 29 sent to surgeons, 11 survived complete removal, 4 survived partial. Expected yield exceeded by 2. Expected yield. That's how they described children surviving mutilation. But survival was only the beginning of transformation. The boys who made it through those first horrible days faced weeks of recovery. Infection killed more than the initial cutting. Surgeons, if you could call them that, packed wounds with boiling oil or resin. Some used hot sand. The screaming could be heard 3 streets away from the cutting houses. Neighbors complained about property values, not the horror. The Ottoman Empire industrialized the process. Special facilities near the Bulgarian border became castration factories. Christian boys captured in raids were processed in batches, 50 here, 100 there. The facilities operated like slaughterhouses, with drainage channels for blood and burial pits for the majority who didn't survive. Documents from the Topkapi Palace reveal the mechanical precision. Surgeons were paid per successful eunuch, not per procedure. This encouraged speed over care. A skilled cutter could process 20 boys in a day. At standard survival rates, that meant 2 living eunuchs and 18 small graves. The boys who lived faced something worse than death. Their wounds would heal, but the cut went deeper than flesh. They'd entered a system that needed their mutilation, depended on it, profited from it. Some were cut completely, everything removed in procedures that left them squatting to urinate for the rest of their lives. Others endured partial castration, testicles removed but penis left intact, a mockery of manhood that served specific purposes in the palace hierarchy. The age of cutting mattered enormously. Boys castrated before puberty never developed male characteristics. Their voices remained high. Body hair never grew. Muscle mass stayed childlike even as they aged. They became perpetual children in adult bodies, exactly what the palace system required. Boys cut after puberty's onset retained some masculine features, deeper voices, stronger builds. These differences determined their futures in ways they couldn't yet understand. Regional preferences emerged over centuries. Ethiopian boys were prized for complete castration, SAD. Something about their constitution, traders claimed, helped them survive total removal. Circassian boys underwent partial procedures more often. Indian eunuchs, cast out from their birth communities, arrived already cut by their own cultural practices. Each group faced different survival rates, different prices, different fates. What happened next would echo through palace corridors for centuries. The trade routes adapted to demand. Certain ports specialized in eunuch shipments. Certain seasons saw increased trafficking. CAS. Spring raids meant summer cuttings, meant autumn deliveries to palace buyers. An entire economy built on mutilation, justified by religious loopholes and administrative needs. The Prophet had forbidden castration of humans. Islamic law was clear, but empires found ways around inconvenient rules. If the cutting happened outside Muslim lands, in Christian territories, in pagan regions, then Muslim traders and rulers could claim clean hands while buying the results. This geographic loophole created the border castration centers, places where tribal raiders sold boys to Christian surgeons who cut them for Muslim buyers. The screams from the castration tents were nothing compared to the silence that followed, a silence that would define an empire's most trusted servants. The surgeon's blade paused. This boy was marked for complete removal. Different cuts served different purposes in the palace ecosystem. The knife's path determined everything: career prospects, social standing, even the specific humiliations a eunuch would endure. Complete castration, IN, penis and testicles removed, created the most trusted servants. These smooth eunuchs could enter any space, guard any woman, hold any secret without suspicion of sexual capability. The procedure's survival rate? Perhaps 1 in 20 on a good day. Partial castration offered better odds but limited opportunities. These eunuchs retained their penis but lost their testicles, chemically neutered but visually intact. They couldn't serve in harems. Too much temptation remained, administrators believed. Instead, they filled military roles, administrative positions, jobs where complete sexlessness wasn't required. The survival rate improved to maybe 3 in 10, still horrific but commercially viable. The cutting itself followed regional traditions. Egyptian surgeons preferred swift, single cuts with curved blades. Persian practitioners used a sawing motion, claiming it reduced bleeding. Byzantine Christians who operated the border facilities employed hot irons to cauterize as they cut. Each method had advocates. Mortality statistics, preferred seasons for operation. Medical texts from the period describe procedures with chilling detachment. The boy must be bound firmly, legs spread and secured. An assistant holds the organs taut while the surgeon cuts. Speed is essential. Prolonged procedures increase mortality. For complete removal, cut as close to the body as possible. Pack with boiling resin immediately. Insert a lead pipe to maintain the urinary channel during healing. The decision made in that moment would determine everything that followed. Complete eunuchs commanded higher prices, but required greater initial investment due to mortality rates. Partial eunuchs cost less, but had limited uses. Some traders specialized in one type or the other. Some offered both, allowing buyers to specify their needs. Race played a disturbing role in these calculations. African boys, particularly Ethiopians and Nubians, predominantly underwent complete removal. Palace records suggest this stemmed from racist beliefs about African sexuality. IDA. Administrators wanted no possibility of sexual threat from black bodies near their women. Circassian and Georgian boys more often received partial castration, their lighter skin somehow deemed less threatening even partially intact. The hierarchy extended beyond the initial cut. Among eunuchs themselves, strict rankings emerged. Completely castrated, Ethiopians who survived their mutilation held highest status in many courts. Their survival against such odds marked them as divinely favored. Partially castrated Europeans occupied middle ranks. At the bottom sat voluntary eunuchs from India's Hijra communities, viewed with suspicion for choosing what others had forced upon them. But the physical cutting was just the first violation. Recovery brought its own torments. Boys woke to find themselves forever changed, bodies alien and wrong, infections festered. Many who survived the knife died during healing. Those who lived learned to navigate their new anatomies. Complete eunuchs needed to relearn urination, often suffering incontinence for life. The shame compounded their physical agony. Specialized traders emerged for each category. Some focused exclusively on producing complete eunuchs for harem service. Others supplied partial eunuchs for military units. The Mamluk Sultanate's eunuch cavalry required specific physical capabilities. Riders who could still mount horses despite their mutilation. Ottoman palace schools needed eunuchs capable of intellectual development without sexual distraction. The procedures evolved over centuries but never became merciful. Anesthesia remained primitive, opium sometimes, alcohol occasionally, more often just swift brutality. Boys bit through leather straps. Some passed out from pain, the lucky ones. Others remained conscious throughout, their screams haunting cutting houses across the Islamic world. Those who survived complete removal faced an existence beyond comprehension. Every bodily function reminded them of their loss, sitting to urinate like women, developing feminine fat distributions as hormones shifted. Watching their bodies betray every masculine instinct while forced to serve in hyper-masculine palace environments. The partial eunuchs faced different torments, sexual desire without capability, the mockery of retained organs that couldn't function. Some surgeons specialized in botched procedures, creating intentionally ambiguous anatomies. These half-made eunuchs occupied liminal spaces, neither fully castrated nor intact. They brought lower prices but filled specific niches. Servants, who could enter certain spaces but not others. Guards trusted with some secrets but not all. The medical knowledge accumulated through centuries of systematic mutilation. Surgeons passed techniques through apprenticeships. Trade guilds formed around castration expertise. What began as crude butchery refined into precise atrocity, each improvement in technique enabling more boys to survive into lives of servitude. As the boy's identity bled away with his manhood, slave traders were already planning Phase 2, the systematic destruction of his soul. They gave him a new name on the third day. His birth name was now forbidden speech. The physical mutilation was merely the beginning. Palace administrators understood that creating perfect servants required destroying every connection to their former lives. Boys who survived castration entered systematic programs designed to erase their identities and rebuild them as instruments of imperial will. The process was methodical, refined over centuries into a science of psychological destruction. New names came first. Not chosen names, but assigned identities that marked them as property. Rashid meant rightly guided, guided by masters, not by own will. Kafur meant camphor, white and pure, cleansed of masculine impurity. Mubarak meant blessed, blessed to serve, blessed to suffer. Speaking their birth names brought beatings. Writing them meant death. Within months, many forgot what their mothers had called them. Language followed names into oblivion. Boys from distant provinces were forbidden their native tongues, Arabic or Turkish only, depending on the court. Eunuch supervisors prowled dormitories, listening for whispered prayers in foreign languages, childhood songs in banned dialects. First infractions brought whippings. Second offences meant isolation. Third strikes rarely occurred. Boys learned or disappeared. Here's where systematic cruelty became policy. Eunuchs were grouped by origin, then deliberately separated. Two Circassian boys who might have comforted each other in shared language were placed in different wings. Ethiopian boys were scattered among Arabs and Turks. Loneliness became a tool, isolation a teacher. Without companions who shared their memories, boys clung to their trainers, the very people engineering their transformation. But erasing the past required more than new names and strange tongues. Religious conversion followed for Christian boys, Jewish boys, Hindu boys taken in raids. Not gentle instruction, but forced memorization of prayers, supervised ablutions, public demonstrations of faith. The converted received rewards, alevi, better food, softer beds, positions of minor authority over newer arrivals. Those who resisted faced escalating punishments designed to break will without damaging valuable property. Physical training reshaped bodies already altered by castration. Eunuchs learned specific ways of walking, gliding steps that made no sound on palace floors. They practiced standing for hours without shifting weight, holding chamber pots steady while nobility relieved themselves. Hands were trained to specific tasks. This gesture for summoning servants, that position for holding documents, another for offering refreshments. Every movement choreographed to demonstrate submission. The boys who resisted faced consequences that broke the others. Public humiliations served as teaching moments. A young eunuch who spoke his birth name might be forced to repeat his assigned name 1,000 times before the assembled corps. One who showed defiance would kneel in courtyards holding heavy stones, muscles screaming, while others filed past in silence. The message was clear. Resistance brought suffering. Compliance brought survival. Sleep deprivation aided the transformation. New eunuchs were woken multiple times nightly for prayers, inspections, arbitrary tasks. Exhaustion made resistance impossible, thinking difficult. In this twilight state between sleep and waking, new identities took root more easily. Boys began dreaming in their imposed languages, responding to their assigned names without thinking. Rewards played as crucial a role as punishments. Eunuchs who excelled in training received privileges, an extra blanket, a moment in the gardens, a sweet with evening meal. These tiny kindnesses, administered by the same system that mutilated them, created complex emotional dependencies. Stockholm Syndrome wasn't a recognized concept, but palace administrators understood its principles intimately. Sexual shame reinforced psychological control. Eunuchs were taught their mutilation made them pure, closer to angels than intact men driven by lust. Yet, they were simultaneously reminded of their incompleteness, their failure as men. This dual message, holy in their suffering, disgusting in their disfigurement, created internal conflicts that prevented unified resistance. What emerged from this process barely resembled human beings in conventional terms. After months or years of systematic identity destruction, successful graduates thought in permitted languages, answered only to assigned names, moved in prescribed patterns. They'd internalized their servitude so completely that freedom became terrifying. Where would they go? Who would they be? Their old selves were dead, and only the palace gave their existence meaning. The most broken became trainers themselves, perpetuating cycles of abuse with the fervor of the converted. They knew which punishments broke spirits fastest, which rewards created deepest dependencies. Former victims became expert victimizers, proving their transformation complete. Some retained secret selves, hidden identities preserved in silence. They might remember a mother's lullaby but never sing it. They might recall their true names but never speak them. These internal resistances, invisible to masters, provided the only sanctuary in lives otherwise totally controlled. But even these private rebellions came with costs: the constant fear of revelation, the agony of performed submission, while hearts screamed defiance. The perfect servant was now created, but the system that made him would soon offer him power beyond any intact man's dreams. The Grand Vizier bowed to the slave, the castrated slave who controlled the empire's purse. Power in Islamic courts flowed through strange channels, and none stranger than the elevation of mutilated slaves to positions commanding vast authority. The very emasculation that marked eunuchs as subhuman paradoxically qualified them for heights of influence intact men could never reach. This twisted logic, I see, that those incapable of founding dynasties could be trusted with dynasty-shaping power, created a parallel government of the castrated. Consider Kafur al-Ikhshidi, who ruled Egypt in all but name during the 10th century. Born in Ethiopian slavery, castrated as a child, sold for 18 dinars, less than a good horse. Yet this mutilated slave boy would command armies, negotiate with caliphs, and die possessing wealth that would have bought 10,000 boys like his younger self. His castration, the very mark of his worthlessness, became his qualification for power. The mechanics were simple. Rulers needed administrators they could trust absolutely. Intact men had families, ambitions for their sons, loyalties beyond the palace. They might build power bases, forge marriage alliances, dream of succession. Eunuchs had none of these dangerous possibilities. Their mutilation made them perfect instruments of imperial will, intelligent enough to govern, broken enough never to threaten. Free men waited while slaves decided their fates. In the Abbasid court, eunuch chamberlains controlled access to caliphs. Nobles bearing urgent news cooled their heels in anterooms, while castrated slaves determined who deserved audiences. The chief eunuch's nod meant more than a duke's recommendation. His frown could end careers, destroy fortunes, redirect imperial attention. Treasury positions particularly suited eunuchs. Who better to guard vast wealth than those who could never pass it to heirs? The Ottoman Empire's chief black eunuch controlled religious endowments worth more than many European kingdoms. He assigned judges, distributed charity, funded mosques, all while remaining legally property himself. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Slaves owning nothing personally administered everything communally. Military command offered another avenue to eunuch authority. The Fatimid Caliphate's armies often marched under castrated generals. These commanders couldn't father military dynasties like intact generals might. Their loyalty remained institutional, not familial. Soldiers followed them, knowing their orders came from the palace alone, untainted by personal ambition. But this borrowed power came with a terrible price beyond the initial mutilation. Eunuchs exercised authority without legitimacy. They commanded but couldn't compel personal loyalty. Their power was entirely derivative, flowing from masters who might die tomorrow. Every sunrise brought potential obsolescence. Every palace intrigue threatened not just position but life itself. Resentment from intact nobles festered constantly. Imagine bowing to someone you considered less than a man, taking orders from a being Islamic law classified alongside women and children. The humiliation bred dangerous hatreds. Eunuchs navigated courts full of men who despised their authority, plotted their downfalls, waited for chances to reclaim natural hierarchies. The accumulation of wealth complicated these dynamics. Successful eunuchs amassed fortunes through gifts, bribes, and careful investment, yet they had no legal heirs. Islamic law was complex here. Could property belong to property? Different schools ruled differently. Some eunuchs adopted younger eunuchs, creating chains of inheritance among the mutilated. Others saw their wealth revert to masters upon death, making their fiscal success ultimately meaningless. Intelligence networks particularly valued eunuch administrators. Their access to private spaces, harems, bedchambers, bathing areas, gave them unparalleled information-gathering capabilities. The chief eunuch often knew more state secrets than the vizier. He heard what wives whispered, what concubines gossiped, what princes plotted when they thought only sexless servants listened. The very mutilation that enabled their rise would ensure their fall. Eunuchs remained forever dependent on the masters who employed them. Unlike intact administrators who might retire to estates, maintain influence through family connections, or transfer loyalties to new rulers, eunuchs had nowhere else to go. Their power evaporated the instant their protector died. This dependency created desperate loyalties. Eunuchs would poison rivals, fabricate evidence, murder threats to maintain their masters' positions. Not from love, though complex emotional bonds did develop, but from pure survival instinct. A deposed master meant a dead eunuch. The mathematics were stark and simple. Some rose so high they forgot their fundamental vulnerability. They gave orders to princes, distributed fortunes, commanded respect through fear. But every triumph remained contingent. Every authority borrowed. The moment of reckoning always came. A master's death, a regime change, a shift in political winds. Then the mighty eunuch remembered he was property, not person. As eunuch advisors whispered in rulers' ears, an entire economy had emerged from their suffering, an economy that needed fresh boys every season. The caravan stopped at the border. 10. Beyond lay the castration camps where 9 in 10 would die. Geography shaped the eunuch trade as surely as the surgeon's knife. Islamic law forbade castration within Muslim lands, but empire required eunuchs. This contradiction birthed a geography of atrocity, the XI, specific locations where religious law met practical necessity, where boys were transformed into commodities through careful exploitation of borders, beliefs, and brutal mathematics. The most notorious centres clustered along the frontiers between Islamic and Christian territories. Verdun in France became an industrial centre for producing eunuchs during the Middle Ages. Jewish merchants, navigating between Christian suppliers and Muslim buyers, facilitated the trade. Christian raiders captured Slavic boys in Eastern Europe. Jewish traders transported them to Verdun. Christian surgeons performed the castrations. Muslim traders purchased the survivors. Everyone kept their hands technically clean according to their own religious laws. Armenia developed another major centre. Christian monasteries there had long traditions of castrating boys for Byzantine courts. When Islamic expansion created new markets, these monasteries adapted. Monks who'd taken vows of compassion supervised procedures that killed most patients. They justified this by claiming they saved souls, the better a castrated Christian than an intact Muslim, they reasoned. Upper Egypt, technically Muslim but practically lawless, hosted camps that processed African boys captured in raids. Here, Coptic Christians performed the cutting, exploiting their minority status. Islamic authorities could claim ignorance while benefiting from proximity. Caravans brought boys from Sudan and Ethiopia. Days later, survivors headed north to Cairo's markets. The dead fed Nile crocodiles. The boys didn't know they'd been sold to death factories until arrival. Traders spoke of special training camps or palace preparation centers. Some boys thought they'd learn crafts, become scribes, join elite guards. The revelation came with the sight of recovery tents, the sound of screaming, the smell of blood and burning flesh. By then, escape was impossible. But the traders had calculated every variable except one: human adaptability. Survivors formed networks. Information traveled along slave routes. Boys began arriving psychologically prepared, if such a thing were possible. Some attempted suicide before the knife. Others had already said their goodbyes, performed their own funeral rites. The trade adapted too, implementing suicide watches, forced feeding, constant surveillance. Seasonal patterns emerged. Spring raids in the Caucasus meant summer castrations in border camps. Autumn shipments filled Alexandria's markets before winter made sea travel treacherous. The agricultural calendar of human misery followed predictable patterns. Traders knew which months brought highest survival rates, i.e., moderate temperatures, reduced infection, neither too hot nor too cold. What happened in those border camps would haunt survivors forever, but we know details from scattered accounts. Boys were sorted by age, race, and intended purpose. Surgeons, CE, a generous term for butchers with medical pretensions, evaluated stock like cattle dealers. This one's hips suggested he'd survive complete removal. That one's constitution recommended partial cutting. The weak were cut anyway. Their deaths were already calculated into profit margins. The camps themselves resembled military operations. Guard towers prevented escapes. Barracks housed boys awaiting procedures. Recovery tents sheltered the cut. Burial grounds handled the majority. Everything operated with mechanical efficiency. Forms were filed, taxes paid, officials bribed. The machinery of mutilation ground on, decade after decade, century after century. Religious festivals increased demand. New caliphs required fresh eunuchs. Palace expansions needed additional staff. Military campaigns demanded eunuch administrators to manage conquered territories. Each spike in demand rippled back to border camps. More boys captured, more procedures performed, more graves filled. Transportation networks evolved to serve this trade. Certain ports specialized in eunuch shipments. Ships carried special holds for transporting recovering boys. Caravan routes included stops at wells, known for medicinal properties that might reduce infection. An entire infrastructure of suffering, hidden in plain sight, maintained by willful ignorance. The economics drove geographical expansion. As traditional sources depleted, too many raids made communities defensive. T.S. Traders pushed into new territories. Central Asia, India, and deeper Africa became hunting grounds. Each expansion brought new castration centers, new border camps, new justifications for old atrocities. Local populations learned to hide their sons. Communities developed warning systems. Boys approaching dangerous ages were sent to relatives, disguised as girls, or scarred to reduce their value. The human cost extended beyond those actually taken. Entire societies lived in fear, shaped their cultures around protecting children from slavers. Different empires preferred different sources. The Ottomans favored Circassian and Georgian boys for certain positions, Africans for others. The Mughals drew from Central Asian populations. Each preference created specific trade routes, specific camps, specific killing fields where boyhood went to die. The boys who survived the knife faced their ultimate destination. The gilded cages called harems, where they'd guard women they could never touch. 400 women lived behind these doors, and 30 castrated men held the only keys. The harem existed as a world within walls, a feminine universe where eunuchs served as the only masculine presence, if being systematically stripped of manhood could be called masculine at all. These guardians occupied an impossible position, trusted because of their mutilation, powerful because of their powerlessness, intimate with women they could never touch, protecting virtue through their enforced sexlessness. The chief black eunuch ruled this hidden realm with authority second only to the Sultan himself. He assigned quarters, mediated disputes, and controlled which women gained access to the ruler's bed. His decisions shaped dynasties. A favorite concubine elevated by his arrangement might bear the next sultan. A wife demoted through his machinations might see her sons passed over for succession. All this power wielded by someone Islamic law classified as less than a man. Daily routines in the harem followed patterns unchanged for centuries. Eunuchs woke before dawn, checking locks, counting residents, ensuring no breaches occurred during the night. They supervised morning ablutions, standing guard while women bathed, their castration rendering them theoretically harmless observers. They distributed meals, managed correspondence, and scheduled the endless rotations of who could visit whom within the harem's internal hierarchies. Every secret learned was another chain binding them to silence. Eunuchs knew which wives hadn't bled for months, which concubines met secretly with palace physicians, which princesses exchanged letters with external suitors. They witnessed tears after miscarriages, rage after rejections, and plots hatched in desperation. This knowledge made them simultaneously invaluable and incredibly vulnerable. The racial hierarchies among eunuch guards reflected and reinforced the harem's own structures. African eunuchs, particularly Ethiopians who'd survived complete castration, held the highest positions. Their perceived absolute sexlessness, (NI), racist assumptions about black hypersexuality, corrected through total removal, made them the ultimate guardians. White eunuchs from the Caucasus served in secondary roles. Indian eunuchs, when present, occupied the lowest rungs. But the women they protected became their greatest danger in unexpected ways. Decades of proximity bred strange intimacies. Some eunuchs became confidants, the only men these secluded women could speak with freely. Emotional dependencies developed. A few historical accounts suggest romantic feelings, never consummated, always tragic. The cruelty was exquisite. Guardians who could offer everything except what both might have wanted most. The harem held darker purposes than mere seclusion of royal women. It served as a prison for potential threats, sisters who might inspire rebellions, daughters who might make dangerous marriages, wives who'd fallen from favor but couldn't be divorced without political consequences. Eunuchs became wardens as much as guardians, ensuring these gilded prisoners never escaped, never communicated with potential allies, never threatened the established order. The mutual imprisonment bound eunuchs and women in complex relationships. Both groups were property, valued for specific functions, discarded when those functions ended. Both lived lives circumscribed by walls, rules, and the whims of masters. Yet the power dynamics remained starkly unequal. Eunuchs held keys, controlled movement, and reported to male authorities. Women remained subject to their supervision, their freedom mediated through beings the system barely recognized as human. Physical proximity, without sexual possibility, created unique tensions. Eunuchs dressed women for royal presentations, arranged their hair, applied cosmetics. They touched female bodies constantly in service, but were expected to remain as neutral as furniture. The psychological toll, Tate, handling beauty they could never desire, facilitating intimacies they could never experience, drove some to madness. But the harem held darker purposes than mere seclusion. Political intrigue flourished in these feminine spaces. Mothers plotted for sons' successions. Wives schemed against rivals. Concubines maneuvered for attention. Eunuchs became instruments in these machinations, carrying messages, arranging accidents, facilitating poisonings. Their survival often depended on backing winning factions. The system created emotional deformities matching physical ones. Eunuchs developed fierce loyalties to particular women, not romantic but something harder to classify. They might risk everything to protect a favored princess, destroy themselves serving a particular wife's ambitions. These bonds, formed in the crucible of mutual captivity, defied easy categorization. Some eunuchs found ways to exploit their positions. Information was power, and they controlled information flow. A eunuch might accept bribes to carry letters, arrange meetings, or simply report favorably on a woman's behavior. The corruption was endemic, almost expected. Everyone understood that being stripped of normal human pleasures would seek compensation somehow. As decades passed, these mutilated guardians accumulated secrets that could topple dynasties, secrets that made their masters' deaths their own death sentences. The young eunuch stared at playing children, knowing he'd never create life, only serve those who could. The cruelest cut went deeper than flesh. It severed futures, ended lineages before they began. Every eunuch represented not just a mutilated individual but an entire genealogy terminated, countless potential descendants never born. They moved through worlds celebrating fertility, serving families whose continuation they ensured while bearing the absolute certainty of their own genetic death. Palace gardens became sites of particular torment. Young princes played under eunuch supervision, racing through courtyards where their guardians had lost the ability to create such life. The mathematical precision was heartbreaking. A eunuch might spend 40 years raising other men's sons, teaching them, protecting them, even loving them in the complex ways their positions allowed. Yet he would die without a single child to mourn him, remember his name, or carry forward any piece of his existence. The psychological impact manifested in various ways. Some eunuchs developed intense paternal feelings toward their charges, pouring all their thwarted reproductive energy into ensuring these borrowed children's success. Others grew bitter, subtly undermining the boys they supervised, perhaps unconsciously punishing them for representing everything stolen by the knife. Most fell somewhere between not, professionally caring, emotionally distant, forever separated by an unbridgeable biological gulf. Social isolation compounded reproductive isolation. Intact men gathered in coffee houses, discussing sons' achievements, arranging daughters' marriages, planning family futures. Eunuchs had no place in such conversations. They existed outside the fundamental human narrative of generation and continuity. Even slaves could dream of freedom and families. Eunuchs faced freedom, meaning only a different kind of isolation. But some eunuchs found ways to build twisted families from the wreckage of their mutilation. Older eunuchs might adopt younger ones, creating chains of non-biological inheritance. These relationships provided some simulacrum of family structure, Siaf, someone to care for in old age, someone to remember you after death. Yet everyone involved understood the artificiality, the desperate construction of connection where biology had been severed. The bonds between castrated men became their only solace, yet these relationships carried their own complications. Shared trauma created understanding, but also triggered mutual remembering. Every eunuch reminded every other of what they'd lost. Gatherings of the mutilated became exercises in collective grief, masked as camaraderie. They spoke their own language of loss, understood through glances what intact men could never comprehend. Religious comfort proved elusive. Islam promised paradise with restored bodies, but what restoration meant for eunuchs remained theologically unclear. Would they be returned to states they'd never known, given adult male bodies they'd never inhabited? Some scholars suggested eunuchs would become heavenly beings, neither male nor female, perfected in their sexlessness. The comfort was cold indeed, an eternity, as divine extensions of their earthly mutilation. The particular cruelty of serving rulers' children intensified over time. Eunuchs watched infants become toddlers, boys become men, all while frozen in their own truncated development. They taught princes to ride, to fight, to govern, all masculine activities they performed without masculine identity. Some young princes grew fond of their eunuch guardians, not understanding why these gentle teachers seemed so sad when watching them play at being fathers with toy soldiers. Yet even these relationships were poisoned by the system that created them. A eunuch who grew too attached to a particular prince risked accusations of inappropriate influence. One who remained distant faced charges of negligence. The emotional balance required, engaged but not attached, caring but not loving, demanded constant vigilance against normal human feelings. Marriage, that fundamental human institution, remained forever closed. Some eunuchs formed partnerships with women, usually former slaves or social outcasts who accepted sexless companionship over solitude. These arrangements provided domestic comfort but highlighted absence, sharing beds they could never use as intact men would, participating in intimate life while fundamentally excluded from its central purpose. The economics of childlessness created additional hardships. Intact men built businesses to pass to sons, accumulated wealth for daughters' dowries. Eunuchs faced the meaninglessness of accumulation without inheritance. Why save when you had no one to save for? Why build when your death ended everything? Some spent lavishly, living each day as if it were their last since, in genealogical terms it was. Documentation suggests some eunuchs attempted to leave other legacies. They funded mosques, established schools, created charitable endowments. These institutional children might carry their names forward where biological ones couldn't. Yet buildings crumble, institutions forget their founders. The permanence they sought remained elusive. Generation after generation, the practice spread across empires, dynasty refining the machinery of mutilation. The Abbasid caliph's daily routine required 7,000 black eunuchs and 4,000 white, each, representing 9 dead boys. Scale transformed atrocity into bureaucracy. What began as isolated incidents of castration evolved into vast administrative systems, requiring constant supplies of mutilated boys. The numbers stagger comprehension. The Fatimid palace alone employed over 8,000 eunuchs at its height. The Ottoman imperial complex required 12,000. Each living eunuch represented 9 dead boys. Multiply the visible horror by 10 to approach the true cost. The machinery operated with terrifying efficiency. Procurement departments calculated annual requirements based on mortality rates, anticipated expansions, and standard turnover. A typical palace might need 200 new eunuchs yearly to maintain operations. That meant acquiring 2,000 boys, allowing for standard wastage during castration and training. Forms were filed, budgets allocated, and suppliers contracted, as if ordering furniture rather than orchestrating mass mutilation. Different departments required different types of eunuchs. The harem needed completely castrated Africans. The treasury preferred partially castrated Circassians. Military administration used Indian eunuchs experienced in Mughal practices. Each requirement generated specific procurement orders, transmitted through commercial networks to suppliers who filled them with mechanical precision. Every palace expansion meant more boys fed to the knife. When Sultan Mehmed II built his new palace in Istanbul, Contemporary records show orders for 3,000 additional eunuchs. Simple mathematics reveals the horror. 30,000 boys purchased, 27,000 dead, 3,000 delivered. An entire generation of children from certain regions disappeared into Ottoman administrative needs. The institutional memory of these operations survived in unexpected places. Palace architects included eunuch quarters in initial designs, calculating space requirements based on projected staff needs. Medical facilities specialized in treating castration complications. Burial grounds near training facilities expanded regularly, their growth a silent testament to industrial-scale child murder. Training academies institutionalized the transformation process. The Ottoman Palace School enrolled both intact boys for administrative training and eunuchs for specialized roles. They studied side by side, future viziers learning alongside castrated contemporaries. The psychological dynamics were intentionally cruel. Intact students saw what failure might bring. Eunuch students faced daily reminders of what they'd lost. The numbers reveal a Holocaust hidden in plain sight through centuries of Islamic imperial rule. Conservative estimates suggest over 1 million boys were castrated for palace service between 800 and 1900 CE. At standard survival rates, that represents 10 million murdered children. 10 million boys who died screaming in castration tents so palaces could function with trusted servants. But maintaining this system required constant fresh victims. Eunuchs aged, died, fell from favor. Unlike other administrative positions that could be inherited or transferred, each eunuch post required a new, mutilated child. The system consumed children with the regularity of a machine burning fuel. Demographic studies of certain regions show gender imbalances, too few boys reaching adulthood, directly traceable to eunuch procurement. The bureaucratization extended to quality control. Palace administrators developed standards for evaluating eunuchs. Voice pitch indicating proper castration timing, physical development confirming complete procedures, psychological profiles assessing loyalty conditioning, rejected eunuchs, e.c., those who survived castration but failed subsequent evaluations, faced fates worse than death, abandonment as beggars, sale to brothels, or disposal in ways historical records delicately avoid specifying. Religious justifications evolved to support industrial-scale mutilation. Court theologians produced treatises explaining how eunuch service represented a form of holy sacrifice. They argued castrated boys achieved spiritual purity through physical loss. These theological contortions provided intellectual cover for atrocity, allowing devout Muslims to participate in systems that violated fundamental Quranic principles about bodily integrity. The ripple effects extended throughout society. Certain regions became known as eunuch sources, their economies warped by the trade. Parents faced impossible choices: hide sons and risk punishment, or surrender them for compensation. Communities developed strategies: early marriages to protect boys, facial scarring to reduce value, even voluntary maiming to prevent worse fates. Record keeping, that hallmark of civilization, documented the horror with dispassionate precision. Palace ledgers listed eunuchs like inventory. Received: 200 black eunuchs, 150 white, 50 Indian. Wastage: 23 dead, 12 rejected, 8 escaped. The humanity reduced to accounting entries, suffering transformed into administrative data. Succession crises revealed the system's grotesque dependencies. When rulers died, thousands of eunuchs faced immediate unemployment, or worse. Some were transferred to new masters like furniture. Others were pensioned off with nowhere to go. Many were eliminated as potential security risks, their lifetime of service ending with execution as blades. As empires rose and fell, only one constant remained: the screams from castration tents and the silence that followed. The invoice was simple: 20 boys purchased, 2 eunuchs delivered. Standard wastage. Commerce transformed child mutilation into standardized business practice. Markets developed price points, quality grades, and return policies for human beings systematically destroyed. A specialized vocabulary emerged to discuss atrocity with the dispassion of grain trading. Standard wastage for death rates. Prime stock, for healthy boys likely to survive. Seconds, for those bearing defects that might reduce survival odds but justified lower prices. Pricing structures reflected cruel mathematics. A healthy 8-year-old Circassian boy might cost 50 dinars in Damascus markets. The same child, successfully castrated and healed, commanded 500 dinars in Cairo. The markup covered not just the procedure, but the 90% who died creating each survivor. Buyers paid for scarcity created through mass murder. Seasonal fluctuations affected pricing like any commodity. Spring brought fresh supplies from raids, lowering costs. Winter's travel difficulties raised prices. Religious festivals spiked demand. New rulers required entire retinues, creating sellers' markets where individual eunuchs commanded thousands of dinars. Economic principles operated with complete indifference to human suffering. Different grades emerged based on survival likelihood and intended use. Premium boys were young, healthy, and ethnically suitable for complete castration. Standard stock could undergo partial procedures. Bulk purchases involved older boys or those with minor defects, accepted with the understanding that survival rates would be lower. Volume discounts encouraged large-scale procurement. Traders kept meticulous records of their human destruction. Surviving ledgers reveal the banality of industrialized evil. Bought 40 boys at spring market. Delivered to Ibrahim the cutter. Collected 6 eunuchs after healing period. 4 prime, 2 standard. Acceptable return. The mathematical precision masks a simple reality. 34 children died to produce profit margins. Insurance systems developed around the trade. Traders could pay premiums to guarantee minimum survival rates. If too many boys died during castration, insurers compensated the difference. This perverse system incentivized better surgical techniques, MAF, not from mercy but from profit protection. Improved survival rates meant better returns for everyone involved, except the victims themselves. But the ledgers hid stories that would sicken any conscience. Behind, boy, Circassian, age 10, 45 dinars, was a child with a name, a mother who screamed when raiders took him, a future destroyed for palace convenience. The economics of agony required willful blindness to individual humanity. Boys became units, suffering became overhead, death became wastage. Credit systems financed large-scale operations. Merchants borrowed to purchase boy lots, repaying loans from eunuch sales. Default meant creditors seized remaining inventory. The financial instruments of legitimate commerce, promissory notes, letters of credit, compound interest, all applied to child mutilation with perfect capitalist efficiency. Transportation costs factored into calculations. Moving boys from capture sites to castration centers, then to markets, required significant investment. Traders developed efficient routes, bribing officials, maintaining way stations. Some specialized in particular legs, those who moved boys to borders, those who transported survivors to markets. Each link in the chain profited from perpetuating atrocity. The most valuable eunuchs carried the darkest histories. Complete castration survivors from Ethiopia commanded premium prices. Their rarity, perhaps 1 in 30 survived the total removal preferred for African boys, made them luxury items. Buyers paid thousands for the privilege of owning someone whose survival defied probability. Fraud plagued the markets. Sellers passed off partially castrated boys as complete eunuchs, risking buyers' wrath when deception was discovered. Some traders drugged boys to hide infections that would kill them days after sale. Others lied about ages, origins, or castration quality. An entire subset of palace administrators specialized in verifying eunuch authenticity. Market days in major cities became spectacles of normalized horror. Cairo's eunuch market operated near the mosque, the call to prayer mixing with auctioneers' chants. Buyers inspected merchandise, checking castration scars, evaluating healing, assessing psychological conditioning. Boys stood naked on platforms while merchants discussed their mutilation like livestock characteristics. The vocabulary of commerce sanitized atrocity. Wastage meant dead children. Processing meant castration. Conditioning meant psychological torture. Delivery meant traumatized survivors arriving at final destinations. Language itself became complicit, enabling participants to discuss industrial-scale child murder without acknowledging its reality. Competition drove innovation in horror. Traders who reduced death rates could offer better prices. This encouraged development of specialized facilities, trained surgeons, and refined techniques. Market forces improved survival rates over centuries, PS, from perhaps 1 in 20 to 1 in 10, each improvement representing thousands of boys who lived to suffer rather than dying quickly. This economy of agony would continue for 1,000 years, until the final generation discovered their protectors could no longer save them. When European gunships arrived in 1856, the palace eunuchs knew their ancient protection was ending. Change came not through moral awakening but through military humiliation. European powers, themselves guilty of countless atrocities, discovered useful outrage at Islamic castration practices. The British, who'd starved millions in India, suddenly cared deeply about Ottoman eunuchs. The French, busy civilizing Africa through massacre, expressed horror at Mamluk mutilations. Hypocrisy aside, their pressure began dismantling thousand-year-old systems. The last generation of eunuchs faced unique agonies. They'd endured castration for institutions already dying. The knife had stolen their manhood to serve courts that would cease existing before they reached middle age. They were historical orphans, too late for the power previous generations wielded, too early for whatever freedom might follow abolition. Abdul Hamid II's palace contained the Ottoman Empire's final great eunuch community. 3,000 castrated men maintained traditions increasingly meaningless in a modernizing world. They guarded harems where women read French novels and discussed suffrage. They administered treasuries drained by European debt. They protected rulers who cowered before ambassadors their predecessors would have ignored. The testimonies from final survivors provide our clearest windows into eunuch experiences. Nadir Agha, last chief black eunuch, dictated memoirs before his death in 1909. He described watching the system collapse. "We were ghosts, guarding other ghosts. The young eunuchs couldn't understand why they'd been cut for positions that no longer mattered. The old ones pretended nothing had changed, while everything crumbled." Freedom meant nothing to men mutilated for dead systems. When reformers finally banned castration and dissolved the imperial households, thousands of eunuchs faced liberation they'd never sought. Trained from childhood for palace service, psychologically dependent on institutional structures, physically marked as belonging to vanished worlds, where could they go? Who would employ them? How could they exist outside the only reality they'd known? Some former eunuchs found work in wealthy households that mimicked palace structures. Others became curiosities in European travellers' accounts, interviewed about their mutilations for shocked Western audiences. A few achieved minor celebrity writing memoirs or giving lectures. Most disappeared into urban poverty, begging on streets where they'd once walked as officials. The psychological displacement exceeded physical hardships. These men had constructed entire identities around serving institutions that no longer existed. They were living artifacts of abolished systems, carrying in their bodies proof of practices new governments desperately wanted forgotten. Their very existence embarrassed modernizers, eager to present progressive faces to European critics. But one final cruelty awaited those who'd survived everything: the complete erasure of their histories. New regimes had no interest in preserving records of systematic atrocities. Palace archives were destroyed or sealed. Official histories minimized or ignored eunuch presence. The last generation watched their entire existence being written out of memory. The end came differently across the Islamic world. Ottoman eunuchs faced gradual dissolution as reforms slowly dismantled palace structures. Persian eunuchs experienced more violent conclusions during revolutionary upheavals. North African eunuchs found themselves irrelevant as European colonization imposed new administrative systems. Each ending was unique, but all shared common themes of abandonment and erasure. Medical advances mocked their mutilations. European doctors published studies on hormone therapies that might have helped eunuchs if developed earlier. Surgical techniques emerged that could have reduced castration mortality to negligible levels. The last eunuchs lived to see their agony transformed into preventable tragedy, their suffering rendered scientifically unnecessary. The final documented palace castration occurred in 1903, though illegal operations continued in remote areas for decades. The last known Ottoman eunuch died in 1979, taking with him memories of a world that had discarded him 7 decades earlier. He'd outlived the empire that mutilated him, the system that employed him, and the culture that created him. Photography preserved some final images. Elderly eunuchs posed uncomfortably for Western cameras, their faces revealing layers of endurance, resignation, and inexplicable dignity. These photographs remain our last visual connections to 1,000 years of systematized mutilation. In their eyes, we see reflections of 10 million boys who didn't survive to be photographed. The abolition of palace eunuchry closed one of history's darkest chapters, but it offered no redemption to its victims. They remained forever changed, forever marked, forever excluded from the normal human experiences their mutilations had stolen. They died one by one in the 20th century, usually alone, often forgotten, carrying secrets of suffering modern minds can barely comprehend. As the last caliphates crumbled, eunuchs like Rashid discovered the ultimate truth. When their masters died, they died with them, which brings us back to that silver bell tolling through marble corridors. The footsteps stopped outside Rashid's door. 4 guards, as he'd calculated, maybe 5. His 23 years of palace service had taught him to read sounds like texts. The heavy tread of executioners differed from the shuffle of normal palace guards. These men had come to kill. Open, commanded a voice he recognized. Mustafa, the new vizier's man. They'd worked together just last week, planning the treasury audit. Now Mustafa would oversee his death. The revolution of fortune was complete. Rashid rose from his prayer mat with the fluid grace castration had forced him to perfect. No sudden movements, no threatening gestures. Even now, facing death, the training held. He unlocked the door with steady hands, the same hands that had counted millions in gold, written thousands of secret reports, held the empire's financial secrets. They didn't bind him. Professional courtesy or final mockery, he couldn't tell. As they walked through corridors he'd glided along for decades. Rashid's mind wandered to that day in the slave market when he was 8. His price, 35 dinars. The cost of his castration, perhaps 5. His value to the empire, incalculable. His worth now, nothing. The execution chamber lay beneath the palace kitchens. Practical placement, drainage for blood, fires to destroy remains. How many eunuchs had died here over the centuries? Hundreds? Thousands? Each one eliminated because they knew too much. Served too faithfully. Survived too long. The blade that took his manhood at 8 would be kinder than the one approaching now. That first cutting had stolen his future but given him purpose. This one would simply end a life that should never have been shaped as it was. He'd survived the 90% who died during castration, only to face this inevitable conclusion. As they positioned him, Rashid thought of the other eunuchs throughout the palace. How many would die today? The old tradition held firm. New masters meant dead eunuchs. Their lifetime of service, their sacrificed manhood, their accumulated knowledge, MIDI, all liabilities now. By sunset, the palace would be cleansed of those who knew too much. His last thought was of his mother. Did she still live? Did she ever wonder what became of the son sold to slavers? He'd forgotten his birth name years ago, but sometimes in dreams, he heard her voice calling something he could never quite remember. Perhaps in death, he'd remember. Perhaps in paradise, he'd be whole. The blade fell. Across a millennium, scenes like Rashid's execution repeated countless times. The Abbasid Caliphate alone created an estimated 200,000 eunuchs during its reign. The Ottomans probably doubled that number. Factor in the Fatimids, Ayyubids, Mamluks, Mughals, and dozens of smaller Islamic dynasties, and conservative estimates suggest over 1 million boys were successfully castrated for palace service between the 8th and 20th centuries. But remember the mathematics. For every eunuch who lived, 9 boys died. 10 million children fed to the knife. 10 million boys whose screams echo through history, whose deaths enabled palaces to function, whose suffering was written off as acceptable wastage in the ledgers of empire. The practice ended not through moral evolution but through external pressure and institutional collapse. The last formal palace castrations ceased in the early 1900s, though illegal operations persisted decades longer. The final generation of eunuchs died out through the 20th century, taking with them memories of systematic atrocity normalized as administrative necessity. Modern human trafficking carries echoes of the eunuch trade. Different purposes, same dehumanization. Children transformed into commodities. Bodies modified for profit. Suffering industrialized and rationalized. The methods evolved, but the essential evil remains. The powerful consuming the powerless, justifying atrocity through institutional needs. How did civilization create and sustain such systems? How did empires built on submission to divine will orchestrate millionfold child murder? The answer lies not in unique Islamic cruelty, but in universal human capacity for normalized atrocity. Given institutional justification, economic incentive, and social acceptance, any culture can transform unthinkable horror into everyday practice. The silver bell still hangs in that palace, silent now, but its echo reminds us how civilization can make monsters of us all.